to say that it is the individual by nature who has the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. But notice today how altruism, concern for the interest of others over oneself, has completely dominated the claim to moral rightness by those who are advocating socialism. Notice how the consumers are always granted a higher status over the producers. After all, they're the ones who are in need. They need the product on a moral level. In terms of the economics of redistribution, because economics textbooks following this basic moral lead have not even solidly considered the nature of production. They all start with consumption first, and then the primary issue in economics is redistribution. So consequently, we end up with an elevation of consumers over producers. Paraphrasing Ayn Rand from Atlas Shrugged, and I'm just paraphrasing, there are natural resources out there like a rock, a mud puddle, a factory, or a doctor's office. And the problem becomes then one simply of redistribution. So the economics of redistribution ties right in with the morality of altruism and the elevation of those in need over those who produce what those of us in need do need. This all connects back to the phony concept of rights, which has taken hold in this country over the last 3 generations, the idea that rights are rights to the satisfaction of our needs, our wishes, and our whims. That is not what rights are. Rights are our rights to act. But subverting the concept of rights and replacing it with this idea of the satisfaction of our wishes has allowed this redistributionist economics to take over and to be given this moral foundation on altruism. And if you want to know why it is that despite the clear failure of the socialist programs wherever they have been found, clear economic failure, clear failure in terms of human misery, they are still being pursued with the fervor of a moral crusade. That is because they are being pursued with the fervor of a moral crusade by those on the other side. They don't care about the consequences. That's a hard thing to grasp, but they really don't care. Now, what does all this mean? Except about 5 minutes left. What does all this mean for health care? Let me set a couple directions then about where a health care debate should go and where proper health care reform would be found. First off, any proper health care reform has to be morally grounded if it is to be practical. I was on a radio program recently, and the host said that they had been discussing on his show for a month, daily, the so-called health care reform issue. And he said they diced this from every possible direction they could think of. They'd shown it to be an economic failure. They'd seen it to be a political failure. They'd seen it to be unconstitutional, a constitutional failure. They had seen it in terms of history to be a failure. They had looked at examples of foreign countries that had been a failure everywhere. And he asked me, how could something that is such an abject failure everywhere still be pushed? And I said, that is because it is a moral failure. Now, in contrast to almost all university academics, I don't think that morality is a subject detached from the practical needs of life. The reason that socialized medicine has been such a failure in all those areas is because it is a moral failure. It is morally wrong. And anything that is that deeply morally wrong must and will fail in all those other areas. So if the issue here is rights then, and the protection of rights, whose rights? And the answer is, of course, everyone's. But it is proper in this debate to consider someone who has been forgotten in almost all the public discourse. Almost all the public discourse has forgotten someone. And who is that someone? And that is the doctor. That is the doctor, that is the medical practitioner, and that is the medical researcher. Any proper reform of health care will be concerned with individual rights and will place first and foremost the rights of doctors to practice as they see fit. Life, remind you, is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. And when I, as a patient, lay on that table and need a biopsy, I'm relying upon the doctor's right to think and to act as he or she sees fit. What else could I possibly be depending upon laying on that table? His consultation with his secretary over the latest 1,000-page set of regulations out of Washington? I'm relying upon his right, his right to his own life, to his liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is high time that the doctors and the medical practitioners be elevated into the central place that they have earned in this debate. All you have to do is think, if you're back on that desert island again, what right to health care would you have there? What right to health care did anyone have in 1850? What right does anyone have to anything? What opportunity does anyone have to have anything unless someone has produced it? And what moral inversion can there be to take the person who has produced it and denigrate him to a third-class position of slavery because he has produced it? Of all the areas I can think of, it is most egregious that this happened in healthcare. It's interesting to think about the word patient. You know, it comes from the Latin word pati, meaning have something done to one. It's a participle. The patient is the person to whom something is being done, and the actor is the agent, ago, the person from I act, right? The person who acts. And consequently, what the patient relies on and needs is the rights of doctors to be able to think and act as they see fit. And that needs to be, I think, the central issue placed to the forefront in this moral argument in favor of individual rights in medicine. We can think about some other aspects of this. How about health insurance reform? As I look at this issue, I've come to think that perhaps the single biggest economic issue and the single biggest political issue regarding insurance is the tyranny of the 50 state governments. It is the state governments who have control over the sale of insurance in their geographic areas. Now, the Constitution has a clause, an interstate commerce clause, which requires the federal government to regulate commerce between the states. And the original conception of that was to make regular. It was to prevent barriers between the states to trade and commerce. The federal government has completely abdicated its responsibility to keep commerce regular between the states as it regards to insurance. And I actually think very strongly that the power of the state governments and the power of the state insurance commissioners needs to be broken so that insurance can properly belong where it belongs, which is with the person being insured. Congress should pass the legislation or perhaps repeal the legislation that allowed this to happen in order to restore the proper meaning of the Interstate Commerce Clause and to break this power of the state governments. Accessibility to health care then would take care of itself. I would advocate unlimited health savings accounts with tax deductions. Personally, the kind of insurance I would like would be completely impossible under any of the bills I've seen. It would be illegal. The kind of insurance I would want would allow me to pay for routine visits myself, to have a health savings account for, let's say, problems up to $50,000, and have a catastrophic policy with maybe a $50,000 deductible, so it could not be ruined. It would allow employers, for example, to offer raises to their employees in lieu of health insurance should the employees want to buy it on their own. Thus reverse the historical error of wage controls during World War II, which companies originally tried to get around by offering insurance to their employees. Everyone's aware of that story, right? During World War II, companies wanted to raise the wages of their employees. They were forbidden to do so by an unjust and unconstitutional act of the federal government. So they got around this by offering insurance. So much for the government, right? Protecting the little guy, and greedy employers don't want to part with any money. And this has allowed this system of bad incentives to develop. I would also think that the government must return to its role as an adjudicator of contracts, so that the court's job is to enforce the terms of the contract as agreed between the parties, not to set the content of those contracts. So if I wish to engage in this contract with an insurance company, should we come down to arbitration or even adjudication, the government would look at the contract and would say, I enforce those terms. Enforce those terms, not dictate them. So in summary here, let us remember, it is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness that needs to be placed into the forefront here. And this means, most of all, understanding and respecting the rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and property of the doctors and medical practitioners upon which we patients all depend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.